please welcome Josh.
Thank you, Brandy. It's a great day in Fort Worth, prime time at DUG Permian. We've got a pretty full hall of, could be 1,000 people. I can't count all of you from here. And WTI is over $100. So what could be wrong, except for the occasional earthquake? But that's kind of west of here. So I'm Josh Adler. I'm the founding CEO of Sourcenergy, which used to be called Source Water. And today I'm going to be talking about seismic response areas and the art of seismic self-defense. And before I get too much into that, there's still a few of y'all out there who might not have heard of Sourcenergy before. I'm curious, how many of you have heard of us, either Sourcenergy or Source Water before? I see you, Jay. All right, well, let the record show 2,000 people out of 1,000 raise their hands, because I couldn't count everybody in that time. Sourcenergy strives to be the technology leader in geospatial intelligence for energy and water in upstream. We're an MIT spin-out based in Houston since 2014. We've had 16 patents granted. We have some of the top E&Ps and oilfield service companies as clients, and we provide an online data service and analytics platform. If you haven't heard of us, it's because the kind of endorsements we get from our customers are like this leading mineral investor who said, we like the edge Sourcenergy gives us over our competitors, so we're not out recommending it. So if you haven't heard of us yet, make sure you find out what they're doing that you're not. Fundamentally, what we do is what you might call omni-channel data fusion. So we take many different kinds of data, marketplace information, regulatory data like permits and production, geoscience, internet, all kinds of satellite imagery, and even mobile GPS location data, and we mix that all together with AI to create new forms of energy intelligence that weren't possible even 5 years ago. And then we turn that into various data products. So today we're going to be talking about one of these in particular, which is Source Water Geo, which is really the first geoscience platform for saltwater disposal capacity and induced seismicity risk analytics. And so let's get into the seismic response areas. First of all, what's shaken? Well, for those of you who haven't heard, since 2018, the number of 3.0 and greater magnitude earthquakes in the Permian Basin has increased by about 9,000%. It's gone from 2 in 2018 to close to 180 in 2021. This is where they've happened, what you see on the graphic here. And if you look at the bottom of that graphic, that's the number of earthquakes per month over that time period. And what you can see is going into 2022, it stopped going up at the same exponential rate, but it hasn't gone down. It stayed at that same high level of the second half of 2021. So this is an ongoing problem. And as a reaction to that huge increase in earthquakes, regulators in both Texas and New Mexico have created a new type of regulation called seismic response areas. Now, you see those on the map now. In Texas, there are 3 of them. There's the northern Culberson Reeves, right in the middle of the Delaware Basin. There's the Gardendale District around Midland and Odessa, which is where this got started. And there's the newer Stanton District, just northeast of there. In New Mexico, they don't have names. They just kind of pop up as earthquakes happen. And so it's important to understand what the rules are about this. Now, don't try to read all this now. Let me say, anybody who wants to see the detailed words that I know you can't read up there in this presentation, send me an email afterwards. I'm happy to share this with you. But the important thing about seismic response areas in terms of the regulation is these are areas where regulators have decided to link increased seismic activity with saltwater disposal. Now, the science around whether and when and how saltwater disposal may or may not cause earthquakes is very unsettled. There are a lot of causes, potentially, of earthquakes. Obviously, there's natural causes, but there's also depletion from producing oil and gas wells, which empty out water, oil, and gas from below the ground. There is EOR, water flooding, which has definitely been linked to seismic activity in some places, like in Snyder, Texas, over many years. Hydraulic fracturing, in some cases, may be linked to seismic activity. And other kinds of mining activities can also cause it. So it's not just disposal. It's not even clear whether it's shallow or deep disposal. But what matters for our discussion today is that this is the link that the regulators are making, and so you need to understand it and know how to react to that. In Texas, they've made specific choices about where to put these areas. But in New Mexico, they just pop up automatically based on a set of rules, namely, if there is one 3.0 or greater magnitude earthquake in New Mexico, you get a 10-mile seismic response area immediately. If there are two 2.5 or greater magnitude earthquakes, then you get an area around that. So certain key facts that you need to know to start to understand what's happening here include how much water goes into these SRA SWDs, where might the water be interacting with the geologic faults, because that's when the earthquake happens. It's an interaction between injected water, essentially lubricating a high fault slip potential geologic fault in the subsurface, and which producing wells are sending that water to those SWDs. Well, first of all, over 400 million barrels, probably at this point more than 500 million barrels of water a year go into SRA disposal wells. It's a lot. That's approximately 10% of the total produced water from the Permian Basin, which everybody here should know is a very high water ratio play. About 10% of it is going into wells that have been designated or shut in because of seismic response areas. And we know that that water, in some cases, may interact with fault lines. Well, where are the fault lines? Turns out, in the Permian Basin, there's a lot of them, and they're kind of everywhere. There's over 3,000 geologic fault lines in the Permian that we have mapped. There's not just one big one. And one of the things we try to do in the Sourcenergy platform is map all of the geologic fault lines in 3D, so you know kind of where to avoid or where you're dealing with that. In fact, all of the images you're seeing on the screen today, these are all actual real screenshots from the Sourcenergy data platform. So these are all things I pulled up late at night putting together this presentation on our own data platform. So you can see there's thousands of geologic fault lines. They are all over the place. Many of them are completely dormant and harmless. Some of them have higher fault slip potentials. Now, the other thing is that a lot of producers don't even know that their water has been going to disposals that are maybe sitting on top of active fault lines, or that have been reduced or shut in, or at risk of getting reduced or shut in because of seismic response areas. We've analyzed this, and about 50% of the water going into SRA disposals actually comes from outside the SRAs. So if you're a producer, just because your producing leases are outside of the SRA boundaries does not mean that you're in the clear. You need to really understand where your supply chain is sending your water. And a lot of times you really don't, because often that's based on a contract with a logistics company or a water midstream company. And under the contract, they take your water away and then you're done with it. But if you're a producer, you could ultimately be held liable for damages caused by your wastewater, even if your MSA with the water handling company says that that liability has been cut off when the water changes hands. That's just how environmental law is. So you have to know where your water is going, and a lot of operators do not, or they think they do and they're wrong. So the industry's short-term response to SRAs has had three components. One is going back to more shallow disposals, like in the San Andres in the Midland Basin. Well, there is a reason why the whole industry over the last few years has been moving to drilling deep disposals. And it's not because they cost about 4 times more than a shallow one. Why is anybody spending $20 million to drill a deep disposal when a shallow one costs more like $3 to $5 million? It's not because they want to spend that money. It's because the shallow formations in many areas, especially in the heart of the Midland Basin, are full. They're overpressured. And what happens when you inject water into an overpressured formation? Well, one, you might be causing seismicity. The links between shallow injection and seismicity are not clear, and there is definitely some association there. It's not just deep disposals that might cause seismicity. Definitely in some cases, shallow disposals might as well. But also when the formation is overpressured and you keep pushing water into it, you can fracture the porous disposal formation, and then the water sloshes around into hydrocarbon reservoirs. It can go down through wells and go into somebody else's reservoir and start watering out their wells or your wells, and then you've got a lawsuit on your hands. And it can also make it more difficult and more dangerous to drill through those overpressured formations to get to the hydrocarbons underneath. So this is a real issue. We can't just go back to shallow disposals and hope that solves it. And anyway, in the SRAs, there's a total moratorium on new disposal permits, shallow or deep. So this is not so easy to do. The second industry response is to move water out of the SRAs, of course, to somewhere that's not restricted. And where there are pipelines to do that, which is not in very many places because there aren't that many water pipelines, this is feasible for a time. But it's hard to build new water pipelines. It's actually harder to do that than it is to build petroleum pipelines for a bunch of reasons, including that you don't have an ultimate recourse to eminent domain with water pipelines the way you do with oil and gas pipelines. And also because every surface owner is competing with you, and so they're not quite as quick to sign a right-of-way on something they might themselves make money on. So it's not so easy to add new pipelines. And if that water does get moved a little bit out of the SRA, does that mean that the SRA itself is going to move? Well, I'll note here, what you're seeing is one of the industry's only maps of the water pipelines. We've mapped over 10,000 miles of Permian water pipelines in the Sourcenergy platform, and that is not available publicly, unlike the oil and gas pipelines. So you need to know where those are. The third of the major industry responses, the one that everyone loves, is recycle more water, and that's a great idea, and we've been pushing that now for the better part of 10 years. But there are challenges with recycling flowback and produced water into new fracs. Probably the biggest one is that even if every frac in the Permian only ever used recycled water and we never touched a drop of fresh water again, and there's reasons why a tiny bit will always be fresh water, we'd still only be replacing about 20% of the total produced water that's coming out of the ground. So that takes some pressure off, but it does not eliminate the problem. And ultimately, you're really just deferring the disposal because eventually that new frac water is going to come back up too. And the other big problem with recycling is, of course, it's fantastic. Everyone should do it all the time. But it's extremely difficult to efficiently recycle flowback because it's a spatio-temporal problem. What I mean is, you can only recycle water when and where there is a new frac starting up that needs that water. And you have to be able to get the water there. And so that's not so easy when fracs are always moving around. You're either long water or short water. So will these solutions be enough? Because the world needs Permian crude right now. We all know for the American consumer, for the Ukrainian war effort, for worldwide inflation and energy demand, we have to be able to produce more crude oil and gas in the Permian Basin. We're the world's leading producer. We're the most active oil field in the world. And so we have to find ways to address whether seismicity is the speed limit on Permian production. Now, before I get into some of the kind of more creative solutions that we've been coming up with at Sourcenergy, let's talk for a little bit about the commercial impact of the Texas seismic response areas. So first, we've actually analyzed this in a lot of detail for each of the 3 Texas SRAs. There's a full breakdown, company by company, of these impacts. I'm giving you the short version here, but there's an appendix to this presentation that I'll share with you that breaks it down for all the companies and all the areas. In aggregate, you can see that it is that Delaware Basin NCR SRA that's about 2/3 of the effective seismic response volume. That's the biggie. And of course, the Delaware Basin, as you might have heard, has unusually high water to oil ratios, probably double the ratio of the Midland Basin, so that makes sense. The 2 companies hit by far the hardest are the 2 that are the biggest producers in the middle of that Delaware Basin area, which is Chevron and Cimarex, now Coterra. The third, which is a much smaller producer but proportionally hit very hard, is Admiral, private equity backed, but it happens that their main producing area and disposal area is right smack dab in the middle of that NCR SRA. The biggest of the commercial water midstream companies to be impacted is Aris, and WaterBridge is up there too. So there's 2 ways economically to look at what is the real impact of the seismic response areas. And what we're looking at here is 2020 water production, not 21, because 2020 is still the most recent year for which there's complete reporting. Of course, it's more water now than it was then. So one way to look at this is oil disrupted. So what I mean by that is, if you had to reduce the amount of oil that's directly associated, essentially at a 4-to-1 ratio, to the water going into those SRA wells. So if you had to just take it down just to the level where it's not a problem anymore, how much oil would have to be reduced and what's the value of that? And you see where the companies get hit with this. The alternative is, what if you had to truck that water somewhere outside of the SRA? And that would increase the cost of the water disposal and logistics anywhere from 5 to 10 times versus putting it in a pipe. That's what we did from 2009 to 2014. For those of you who, like me, were in the water business in that time period, then we moved everything to pipe. But if we have to move from pipe back to truck, you're talking about 5 to 10x cost. Now, at $115 WTI, that's probably manageable. At 50 WTI, that would be a really big problem for some of these companies. The other way to look at this is oil at risk. So what I mean by that is, for any producing lease that is sending any water into an SRA disposal or any SRA disposals, what if they can't find an alternative and those disposals get shut in? Then all of the crude oil being produced by that lease is at risk. And those numbers get much bigger, into the billions of dollars, especially for Chevron and Cimarex. One question we get is, we talked about how, is there a risk that water has to get on trucks and come off of the pipes? This is something that we at Sourcenergy are actually uniquely positioned to analyze, because we have a couple of patents granted on analyzing anonymous cell phone location data in order to understand where water, sand, and crude oil trucks are moving around the basin and who's doing business with whom. And so we did do a little bit of an analysis on analyzing water truck activity inside of the SRAs over the last 2 years. And what we found is, if you look at the bottom there, actually water truck activity did increase a lot, starting right around January 1st of this year, which is when the Gardendale SRA started getting enforced and the SRAs really started going into effect. Having said that, we can't really draw any big conclusions from that, because as we all know, hydraulic fracturing activity across the whole basin is way up since the start of this year. So we haven't tried to separate the SRA impact from the growth in hydraulic fracturing impact on the amount of flow back getting trucked around. So now for the last portion of our presentation, let's talk about the art of seismic self-defense. How do you defend your assets and operations in this environment of seismic response restrictions? And how do you take advantage of it to gain new opportunities from the shifts that are happening in the water supply chain? We're going to talk about getting ahead of it. We're going to talk about contextualizing. And we're going to talk about the best defense, of course, which is a good offense. So first of all, in New Mexico, as I mentioned earlier, if there is a 3.0 mag earthquake within 10 miles of your asset, you are required by the state of New Mexico to report that to them within 24 hours of it happening. They don't go to you, you have to go to them. So what that means is you have to have some type of automated alert system that is based on custom areas of interest around your disposal assets that tell you if any earthquakes happen within a 10-mile radius of any of your assets, you need to know right away. And so this is an example of that on the screen, by the way. Here's a disposal that had a 2.9 magnitude earthquake very close by, but hasn't had a second one yet. Well, if that second 2.5 or greater happens, they got to go to the New Mexico OCD right away. And so this is a good example. And what we've done at Sourcenergy is one of the aspects of our platform is that you can create any number of customized areas of interest for alerts, whether for seismic activity or any number of other activities that we track. So you can upload all your wells or upload all of your lease boundaries, set some boundary or fuzzy area around them, and get alerted if a seismic event happens meeting your criteria, or get alerted, for example, if a frac crew moves into that area. So one of the things we do at Sourcenergy is we track all of the frac crews every day in the Permian within a day or two of where they are, and we know which service company every single one of them works for. Not just the operator, but the service companies. As far as I know, there's no other source for that. And so by tracking those frac crews in near real time across the basin, for an operator, we're able to alert you if somebody else's frac crew moves into an offset lease so that you can prepare and avoid having frac hits destroying your producing assets. And yeah, operators and neighbors try to share that information, but we know that a lot of balls get dropped out there. There's a lot of activity. And so it's very important to defend your assets by protecting against those kinds of events and having those automated alerts across that huge area. We're detecting the frac ponds as they get built to show water demand in satellite imagery. We're tracking the rigs. We're detecting well pads as they get constructed on the ground within a day or two, even when there's been no drilling permits filed yet for those well pads, so that you can get ahead of the demand and the competition for all of those commodities and services that everybody's fighting for right now. So another way of getting ahead is don't buy, build, or send water to disposals that are directly on top of sensitive fault lines or big earthquakes. Now, maybe that sounds a little silly, like, oh, of course you wouldn't. But actually, it happens all the time. And here's a good example of that, real example, pulled from our platform. Here is a disposal that was built right on top of a fault line in that NCR SRA. And before it was built and started pumping water, there was a 4.0 magnitude earthquake less than 2 miles away on the same fault line. And after they started pumping the water into it, which is what's shown on the lower right, the injection every month, there were over 20 more earthquakes within about 1.5 miles of that disposal. it probably would have been good to do that geological research about where the fault lines are before somebody committed to building that disposal and putting their water into it. And we're able to help people do that. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it's important for the operators to get ahead of this problem by knowing where your water is really going for disposal and what are the seismic risk characteristics of every one of those disposals before that disposal gets shut in or restricted and sends you into a scramble with your supply chain where you might have to shut in wells because you don't have a good place to send that water. You want to get ahead of that problem, and we can help you analyze all those producing leases, understand where the water is really going, whether there are risks to those disposals, and then maybe where the better alternatives are. And I'll show you a good example of that in a minute. So the second area of defense that's important is what I'll call contextualizing. Now, we always are quick to point out, you as an operator are always going to know your rock and your operations better than we ever will. There's no question about that. But a lot of times we know other people's rock and operations better than you might. And in the case of seismic activity, that's really important. Because if you get blamed for a seismic event, it's very important that you know everything else that's been going on in the area of that seismic event so that you can maybe point to some other things that might not have been you that need to be investigated, because that might not be your fault, right? It's not your geologic fault. Well, here's a great example of that in the NCR SRA. So down at the south end of this picture, again, all pulled out of our platform, there is an EOG disposal that was reduced by 60% in terms of their capacity because of the NCR SRA. Now, when it was restricted, that was because of an earthquake that happened, a 3.0 mag that's about 2 miles to the north. There's no known fault line between those. Doesn't mean there isn't one, but we don't know about it. But that disposal, that EOG disposal, was operating at like 5% capacity utilization for the prior couple of years when it was cut back. There's no way there was a problem from that disposal. It was doing nothing and the pressure was so low. But now look at what else was going on around that earthquake. It's right on top of a crisscross of 2 known fault lines. There are some big producing wells right on top of it. Remember, depletion is a potential cause of seismicity. And about a mile away, along the very same fault line, there was a different company hydraulically fracturing wells during the 6 weeks right up until the day before that earthquake happened. Now, I don't know whether that hydraulic fracturing caused the earthquake, who knows, but if I'm EOG and I own that disposal well 2 miles to the south, I'd sure want to know about that and probably complain to the Railroad Commission that there was no good reason to cut back my well by 60%, and maybe there's some other things that they should be looking at. Again, if you were relying on the kind of conventional regulatory data to know where the fracs might be happening and might have issues, this would literally be impossible, because the only regulatory or public reporting of frac dates is the Frac Focus database in Oklahoma City, which is essentially voluntary reporting and lags reality by 3 to 12 months. And about 10% of fracs never even get reported at all in there. So that's not going to be a good way to solve your problem if you just got hit with a seismic restriction yesterday. It's really important when you're contextualizing, therefore, to know all of the other possible causes of seismic activity in your area. Everybody else's disposal, and what kind of pressure utilizations they're running at and the trends. I had an example here I cut out for time that shows where a disposal jacked its pressure utilization way up, and right after that, there was a whole series of earthquakes basically right underneath it. If you have another disposal nearby, you want to be able to point to that pressure utilization change of that other guy's disposal. Likewise, you have to know where the fracs are happening every single day. You need to know about EOR, which is in some cases an important cause. And you need to know where all those fault lines are in relation to everybody else, not just your own lease. The last section I'm going to talk about today, and then we'll go for questions, is the best defense being a good offense. And 3 angles I want to point out to that. One is, if you are in water services, water logistics, recycling, disposal, water midstream, there are opportunities abounding to win new water from the supply chain disruptions that are happening because of these SRAs. Here happens to be an example. We've got a big XTO producing lease that's been sending a lot of water 6 miles south into the middle of the Gardendale SRA into a big commercial disposal. That disposal just got shut in. Well, where can they send it instead? There is another commercial disposal only 2 miles away, different company, just to their north outside the SRA. that is a great opportunity for that commercial disposal that's just outside the SRA, and it's going to save XTO money, not just heartache, because it's actually closer and it's going to be less expensive to send water there than where they have been sending it. Another example, we talked about the recycling deals, is that there is a tremendous economic opportunity today in water recycling. The problem is, it is a spatio-temporal problem. So consider this. Every frac is either long water or short water, depending on the moment in time in the process of that frac. At the beginning of any given frac, they're short water. They would love to get more water that they can recycle so that they can eliminate fresh water usage, and they will buy that recycled water from somebody who has excess water. Toward the end of the frac, they have excess flowback that they're going to need to send to disposal unless they can find someone else who's starting up their frac to take it. So you'd love to be able to connect those dots. But to connect those dots, you have to know at least two things every day. You need to know where all the water midstream pipelines are, because none of these numbers make sense if you have to put water in trucks. Forget about it. To make the economics work for recycling, the water has to move in pipelines. So you need to know where all the pipelines are, which we do, and make that available. The other thing you need to know is you need to know where the frac crews are every day, or even when they're getting ready to show up. So for example, Sourcenergy detects frac ponds as they get built in satellite imagery almost every day. There is no other source in the industry for that. And we have found that when you see a frac pond filling up with water, there's about an 80% plus correlation with a first new completion happening nearby within the next 30 days. So in addition to tracking the frac crews as they move around day to day, by knowing where the frac ponds are getting built and filling up, and also we know where the sand trucks are, you know that someone is preparing to frac, and that tells you that there's going to be an opportunity to recycle your water and sell that water to them. Likewise, if you're getting ready to frac, you want to know who is finishing up or who's getting well into their program nearby, near a pipeline, so that you can connect those dots, save a lot of money on water acquisition, and improve your ESG scores by recycling more of the water that's going into your fracs. And the last one is, by knowing where all of the operator supply chain is occurring, company by company, this example happens to be Mewbourne, but it could be any of them, you know that if there are frac crews for a particular company working for a particular operator nearby, and if you know where all of that operator's ducts are, which we do because we're also tracking the rigs, you can now predict where their work is going. You can analyze the infrastructure in that area and the commodity supplies for things like sand and water. And you can go into that operator with a proposal already fully baked that is going to save them money rather than just trying to ring them up on the phone and get lunch and try to pick out of them where that deal is going to be. And you're a lot more likely to get that deal as a service company. As an operator, you're a lot more likely to save money on your operations. So today I know we've covered a lot of material. We talked about seismic response areas, the commercial impacts in Texas of seismic response areas, and some of the art of seismic self-defense, including how to get ahead of it, how to contextualize to understand where someone else might have issues, not just you, and that the best defense is good offense. And so with that, I know that we'll be taking questions outside in the break room. Thank you very much for your time and attention. It's a great DUG Permian this year, and it's a beautiful day in Fort Worth. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to meeting you at our Sourcenergy exhibit booth right up the main hallway there. Thank you very much.